I campaigned as a Conservative and I will govern as a Conservative. My friends, we need to show that we will deliver over the next 2 years. I will deliver a bold plan to cut taxes and grow our economy. I will deliver on the energy crisis, dealing with the people's energy bills, but also dealing with the long-term issues we have on energy supply. I also want to thank our outgoing leader, my friend, Boris Johnson. Boris, you got Brexit done, you crushed Jeremy Corbyn, you rolled out the vaccine, and you stood up to Vladimir Putin. You are admired from Kiev to Carlisle, where we will deliver a great victory for the Conservative Party in 2024. Those were the words of former Prime Minister Liz Truss after she defeated Rishi Sunak in the Tory Leadership Contest back in 2022. Of course, she then went on to be the shortest serving Prime Minister in Britain's history. And today we will be talking about this year's Tory Leadership Contest after Rishi Sunak received the heaviest beating in election history for the Conservative Party. And I have a familiar guest on the podcast today. You may have heard him. He's the co-host of Multipolarity, a podcast talking about geopolitics, which I very much enjoy and recommend anyone to listen. It's our old friend Collingwood.
Thanks for having me back. Pleasure to be here.
Great. And so diving straight into it, on the eve of the election, as the polls had dropped, you said this is the worst result possible because Keir Starmer has just been handed a supermajority, but the Conservative Party essentially won enough seats in order to rebuild itself. Do you stand by those words?
Yeah, I mean, the Conservative Party rebuilding itself is very secondary. The fact is that the Labour Party is, in its current format, a social and constitutional revolutionary force in Britain. It started in 1997 when Tony Blair was elected, continued under Gordon Brown, and they transformed British society and British politics to the extent that the Conservative Party itself had to shift to what was essentially Blairism with slightly lower taxes and slightly lower spending. And the Conservative Party, thus, in my view, deserved to die. It was no longer a Conservative Party. It was conservative only in the same way that the Democratic People's Republic of Korea is democratic and a People's Republic. So there were 2 or 3 potential outcomes of the election. The first was a kind of a very small Labour majority, which was the least likely of the 3, which would have at least kind of created political issues in terms of their mandate to kind of shove things through. Although in the British system, you only really need a majority of 1 to do that if you can hold your parliamentary party together. The second option was a massive Labour majority and a Conservative wipeout, which would have been such a stunning blow to the right of centre establishment in Britain that I think it would have forced a rethink. But the third option is what we got, which was actually the Conservative Party survived with something quite considerably better than the worst case outcome.
Mm-hmm.
And I say that the worst case outcome is very realistic. The first past the post system is brutal for parties once they drop below about 30% of the vote in an election. And yet the Conservative Party still emerged with a core number of seats that allowed them to rebuild. And I think it perhaps wasn't the sort of stunning blow that would force them to rethink. And certainly in the course of their period in power under Theresa May, well, David Cameron, then Theresa May, then Boris Johnson, then Liz Truss. They refused to engage in the reality of the British political situation, which is that the main cleavage in British politics has shifted from the economic cleavage that has existed since 1979 and Margaret Thatcher's election, which was the difference between a redistributive economic system and a kind of a Thatcherite free market system. That main cleavage has now been superseded by a cultural cleavage, the difference between conservatism and progressivism. And the Conservative Party had refused to engage in that. They were mired in a kind of an internal conflict between Blairites, as represented by people like David Cameron and George Osborne, and perhaps to a certain degree Theresa May, but certainly Boris Johnson and people like Rishi Sunak and Jeremy Hunt, the most recent Chancellor of the Exchequer under the Conservative Party, and on the other side, a kind of a Margaret Thatcher cargo cult, neither of which are relevant to the electorate. So I had hoped that if we could kind of pick up one crumb from the kind of the disaster of the election, it would be that the Conservative Party was forced to rethink and engage in this sea change of this political sea change in the United Kingdom. But I don't, I see few signs that perhaps they are at the moment.
And Keir Starmer now, he's been in power for a handful of months. Normally, he should be enjoying his honeymoon period, but his disapproval ratings are through the floor already. Some polls recently have shown that the Conservatives are just, remember, the leaderless Conservatives are just 4 points off Labour already. Sometimes it's not good to compare local elections with national sentiment, but we've seen now there's been a handful of Conservative gains in local by-elections. It's fair to say that Starmer's start to life as Prime Minister has not been easy for him.
No, not at all. Not at all. And I think anybody who engaged in the reality of Britain, the reality of Britain's economy, the reality of our society at the moment, and most importantly, the reality of the driving forces behind politics at the moment, would have understood that Starmer would very quickly, or not very quickly, but Starmer would certainly become, over the course of his term in office, or the course of the kind of like the 5 years before the next election, he would eventually become as unpopular as the outgoing Conservative Party. That hasn't quite happened yet, but it's clear that he's on the way. I have to say, mea culpa, I expected the honeymoon period to last for longer. And in the very immediate aftermath of the election, I felt very vindicated in that. My argument was that the media and the civil service and the broader British establishment, what you might call, what American podcasters, well, not just the blob, but the kind of the broader elite, the people who, the people who could be found on the Islington dinner party circuit, or for any American listeners, the kind of the Manhattan charity auction circuit. They would have been euphoric that finally the Conservatives had been removed. They would be just giddy and thrilled with having one of their own finally back in Downing Street. And my argument was that because of that, the media and the civil service would tend to support the government rather than seek to prevent it from doing what it was doing. They would seek to cover up cock-ups and mess-ups and scandals rather than leak them to the press and then report them with glee. And in the very early days of the election, I felt very vindicated in that, because you had all of these giddy news presenters and opinion editorial writers and columnists talking about how wonderful it felt to have the adults back in the room. And there were even a couple of stories about how Keir Starmer and his wife were actually sexy. And a couple of female columnists talked how they were turned on by the Starmers, like sexually aroused by the Starmers and seeing them out and about. And I thought that even
Well,
if I thought that even if they don't, I mean, they didn't use those words exactly, but that was the gist of the cause. And I thought that even if they didn't deliberately use their voice within the media to kind of big up the stars and overtly support them, their subconscious tendency would be to view their policies in a positive light, to brush aside their failings. But of course, that whole thing was derailed by the riots that erupted after the Southport murders, that great tragedy.
hmm.
And since then, the social unrest and social dissatisfaction that has rippled out of those riots and continued as a thread through discourse has also then been compounded by Starmer taking steps which I predicted he would take, to impose austerity once again on the United Kingdom. On the 18th of June, before the election, I wrote a very long Twitter thread in which I said very specifically that Starmer would engage in austerity because of the economic situation,
Hmm. Hmm.
because of his own tendencies. And now that's coming to fruition. You now have a lot of economists and thinkers and activists on the left starting to get some buyer's remorse. So that's kind of, you had the Southport riots, and now you've had this as well, most prominently with removing the fuel allowance for pensioners, i.e., making pensioners pay the full cost of their heating and electricity bills, which has caused a lot of controversy. So that honeymoon period's been derailed far faster than I expected. It's the old events, dear boy, events situation. But certainly he's on course to be an incredibly popular prime minister, as I think those of us who looked at reality rather than narratives that are spun understood that he would.
I think your multipolarity co-host, Philip Pilkington, described Britain now as entering the age of dark Blairism, where the boring grey-suited technocrats turn into a more authoritarian force in order to push through their ideology.
Yeah, that's. I think that's right. That was a wonderful thread, and it
Hmm.
was
Hmm.
one of those threads that was actually quite funny in a sardonic way. But it was also true, I think, unfortunately. My co-host Philip Pilkington essentially argued that Blair had tried to introduce a series of social and economic reforms that hadn't necessarily worked and were bad for the country, but they were tied to them. The Labour Party and the kind of the left of centre elite was tied to them, whether it be high levels of migration, whether it be a specific form of neoliberalism, whether it be certain social changes and social and constitutional reforms that were negative. And now we're in a situation where Labour is back in power, and they're likely to use some of the tools that Blair created and a more authoritarian bent to actually push through and impose and maintain the grip of power that this kind of creed, I suppose, is the word I'm looking for, it really wants to impose and keep. And I think all of your listeners, being of a social conservative type, will understand exactly what I mean by that.
Well, I think institutions like the Supreme Court will get a lot more power than it. Well, it already has a lot. We've seen in the last couple of administrations, but it's always been Blairism sort of baby in a way. And I think, well, we've already seen reforms to the House of Lords once again. Final hereditary peers are set to be cast away. And I think we'll see uh, a great movement away from Parliament towards more of these unelected chambers, such as the Supreme Court.
Well, I mean, just to go into that, Julian, the first thing that you've got to understand, and I think this has already been borne out by the events that we've seen so far in this Starmer ministry, is that there's very little room economically to engage in the sort of stereotypical left of centre government spending. They will pay public servants more. They are the core base of the political power of the Labour Party. So, we've already seen certain classes of doctors get big fat pay rises, train drivers, all of these sorts of people will get pay rises. But beyond that, there's going to be not only is there going to be an absence of increased spending on the sort of things that the Labour Party would like to spend money on, things like schools and hospitals and public works, but there will be sharp austerity. Now, you have to think about, listeners have to put themselves in the position of a Labour Party leader. He can't give either his parliamentary party, his MPs, or his members, or the party's media outriders what they want, which is higher spending on these things, a greater redistributive system. And in fact, frankly, Keir Starmer isn't minded to do that. If you look at Keir Starmer's history as leader, he's very assiduously cultivated links with big business and the standard neoliberal sorts, rather than the stereotypical economic left, the traditional economic left. So what's he going to do? He's got to keep them happy somehow, and he's got this huge majority, which in a way is dangerous in the British political system, because it's more difficult to impose discipline. If you've got a majority of 4, you can credibly tell your MPs, look, you either vote for this or you risk bringing the government down, because if you vote against it, you easily have a vote of no confidence and so on and so forth. Whereas with a huge majority of the sort that Starmer's got, MPs can say, yeah, so what? I'm going to vote on my principle here, right? I'm going to vote on principle. And it becomes harder to corral the kittens into the lobby to vote in the right way. So what's he going to do with these people? Well, what he's going to do is he's going to buy them off. Like, the red meat that he's going to throw to them is going to be exactly the kind of social and constitutional reforms that they really want. So, as you quite rightly say, things like providing the Supreme Court with more powers, and which is a kind of anathema to the British constitutional system as originally envisaged, because how can you possibly have anything like a court, anything at all, that is supreme to the Crown in Parliament? Like, the Crown in Parliament is sovereign. It is supreme in the British system. So the idea of Supreme Court is preposterous. That's why we used to have the Appellate Committee of the House of Lords, staffed by the Law Lords as the highest court. But you'll also get much greater, as Bournbrook editor Michael Curzon has written about for the European Conservative quite extensively. You will also get greater devolution to these new regions, the metro mayors.
That was his first meeting, wasn't it? Next day after becoming Prime Minister, all of the mayors were invited to 10 Downing Street for a briefing.
And to be fair, look, I've spoken to, or communicated at least, but also spoken to Um, very thoughtful, serious people who know a lot about public policy, who are not ideological. They're certainly not pro-Labour, but they do think that greater devolution to the regions would be a good thing in theory, primarily and mainly with the caveat that they should have greater tax raising powers, because that would provide them with credibility, and that would impose a democratic constraint on them. The problem that I've got is that, first of all, it creates a confusion of the democratic system. Like you you have people like Sadiq Khan and, until quite recently, Nicola Sturgeon in Scotland, and Sadiq Khan in London, I should say, who have these devolved powers and treat their regions as a kind of a personal fiefdom with which to exercise and create and then exercise power of their own. And you get a conflict with Parliament. You get this system where they essentially use their power instead of to improve their, to improve London or to improve Scotland, as a kind of bully pulpit to further their own political aims or the political aims of their party. And you get this democratic conflict between X region and Westminster itself. And the second issue that I have with these is that all of these metro mayors are in like hardcore Labour places. It's a bit like, you could imagine the US if they introduced a similar system in the United States, but it was only focused on, say, a couple of areas in California, New York, Philadelphia, right? Like all of these like hardcore Democratic areas, and like Wyoming and Texas and the hardcore Republican areas were excluded from that. It's a similar situation in Britain, where every single one of these mayors is a Labour mayor, and the only one who isn't is the Teesside mayor, who's a Conservative, but he gets voted in because of his charisma, because he's actually very good at his job, and it's still quite a hardcore Labour area, right? So as soon as he's gone, what's going to happen? That's the point, I suppose. So, I suspect that, and ultimately, what they're doing, Julien, is that they're parceling out the power of Westminster. They're parceling out the not Westminster, but they're parceling out the power, the democratic and legislative power of Parliament, of the Crown in Parliament, of what constitutes sovereignty in Britain. They're parceling that out to the Supreme Court, to these individual regions, to quangos, right? To individual quangos. It's very much kind of stakeholder democracy. It's very much this idea that representative democracy of the sort that we have in Britain, of the sort that we have in that the Americans have, that's less efficient, that's less good than stakeholder democracy, where the demos, the people, are only one stakeholder. There are other stakeholders, such as multinational businesses, such as supranational organizations, such as treaty obligations, such as charities and non-governmental organizations, such as academic experts. All of these individuals are stakeholders, and the demos is just one, and not necessarily the most important. And the idea is that you get better policies and a better run government by taking into account the views of all of the stakeholders rather than just the people. And I personally abhor the very concept of this. And not only that, but I think that the history of the last 25 years suggests that you don't get better policy. Like, does anyone see the EU, which is the kind of like the ultimate stakeholder democracy? Does anyone see the EU as some kind of paragon, as an exemplar of superb policy, of a superbly run organization? I don't think so. Has Britain been better run since the Major then Blair stakeholder democracy revolution? I don't think so. So I think not only do I abhor it on principle, But I think the evidence is in now, and it's not a more effective way of running things. However, people like Keir Starmer and most of the Labour Party are wedded, or sorry, most of Starmer's wing of the Labour Party, the kind of the elite of the Labour Party, and the broader British elite are wedded to this idea, wedded to this system. They view it. They feel more comfortable with the kind of an American system, actually, where you have a Supreme Court, where you have checks and balances within the system, and stakeholder democracy is as a means of doing that. So they're going to continue doing it, and I think they are already. And as I said before, it makes sense because it will be more popular with a group of MPs who ain't getting anything on the economic side.
Now, you touched upon the huge majority. Normally, when a party wins a majority as big as that, I think even the press and the media were already talking about 10 years of Keir Starmer. But this time it feels different. It doesn't feel like this is a stable majority. If we go back to the election itself, of course, we had, I think it was around 5 or 6 independent MPs who were very pro-Palestine, who took seats off of Labour, and there were another 6 or 7 who were under 1,000 votes away from taking seats as well. I think Jess Phillips was very close to losing hers. So you've got this attack from the left, but also if you look at the red wall seats, there are a lot of seats in which Reform were second to Labour. A lot of people talk about Reform splitting the right-wing vote, but actually Reform currently in the majority of its seat is second to Labour. So there seems to be problems on both sides of the aisle for the Labour Party, and a lot of people are questioning whether it really will be a 2-term tenure for Sir Keir Starmer.
Yeah, excuse me. Yes, I think you're right, and I think people are right to question it because, I mean, ordinarily, like 10 years ago, 15 years ago, or just about any time in British history since about 1928, 1930, you would say that a majority of this size, in 3 figures, is cast iron, not just for the next election, but maybe the one after that as well. You would kind of almost expect kind of 10 years at least, and maybe 15, right? It would be bet the house on it. However, the heuristics through which we look at politics at the moment and are able to make snap judgments about the likely course of events in Britain they're breaking down now. I think everyone can tell that we're in a period where politics is in flux in Britain. We touched on it earlier with the kind of the switch of the main cleavage from economics to culture. But there are other aspects of that as well. Much greater forces at play than perhaps we've got time to go into here. But suffice to say, the usual kind of mental models that we have of British politics are really breaking down, and they're not as useful as they were, if useful at all. So I think it's right to question whether the Labour Party is going to be able to win the next election. And as we said earlier, I think it's very clear that Starmer, come the next election, will be tremendously unpopular. However, while in such an environment, you may say, well, actually, it's really on the line whether he'll be prime minister next time. The Conservative Party has really serious problems, and I think more serious than the Labour Party for now. But basically, all British parties. So it's easier to describe it from a European perspective and then come back to Britain, right? So people will know in Europe they have a proportional representation system whereas in Britain and America, we have a first past the post system for electing legislatures. So in Europe, what you get, because it's proportional representation, you get a large number of parties that manage to win seats in a parliament or legislature. And then after the election, you have these coalition discussions and talks to create a government, because no individual party has an outright majority of the parliament most of the time. So you get, 3 or 4 centre-right parties talking, or maybe like 2 centre-right and a centrist party talking, or you get like a far left, a left, and a Green party talking, or whatever, they form a government.
Or in Germany, you can have a centre-left Social Democrats, a Libertarian Party, and a Green Party coalition.
Exactly. What is that called? The Jamaica coalition? Is that because it's
Traffic light, I think they agreed on finally.
Oh yeah, because it's red, green, and yellow, right? It's the Free Democrats who are the kind of like the old-fashioned liberals. It's the Social Democrats, and it's the weirdo Greens of Germany who are. Yeah, it's like, do you remember when the Green Party was kind of protesting against cruise missiles coming to Britain, and they were all for tree hugging and protecting the environment. The Greens in Germany are like super pro-war. They're in favor of shutting down nuclear, but instead of nuclear, they're opening up these horrible lignite brown coal power stations that spew out filth for hundreds of miles. I mean, it's very strange in Germany. I mean, if you do listen to Multipolarity, Annalena Baerbock, who is the German foreign minister and is drawn from the Green Party, member of the coalition, features somewhat regularly on that. But anyway, so in Britain we have we also have coalitions, but they happen before elections, right? So just to take the Conservative Party as an example, in a very traditional sense, you always had the Thatcherites and the kind of like the patrician high Tories, okay? And they formed a coalition and went in. And on the Labour side, you had the kind of like the left-wing progressive wing, the kind of like the liberal left wing, what Americans would call liberal, the that side of things. And then you also had these kind of like hardcore, quite hard socialists. And then in addition to that, you had a kind of like a Christian socialist wing, which was quite, drawn from Methodism and the sort of working class communities who were patriotic, socially conservative, believed in Christianity, and were also quite social. And then that was a coalition that went in. So these are the kind of traditional coalitions, but the Conservatives increasingly have a big problem with their coalition because the 2 main parts of the coalition that form the Conservative Party are both equally unpopular within the election. On the one hand, you've got, as I said earlier, kind of Blairism with slightly lower public spending. And that's the Cameron wing of the party. That's kind of Jeremy Hunt, Rishi Sunak, George Osborne, David Cameron, people
the
like...
adult.
Sorry?
The adults.
Yeah, yeah, the adults in the room who keep messing up the world. So yeah, Penny Mordaunt, who lost her seat. She was a very prominent MP, excellent speaker, I have to say, but farther left than the average Labour Party member. So you have this wing, and then you also have a kind of a Thatcherite cargo cult. Like people who every night say that I believe in the one Lord Margaret Thatcher, who now sits in heaven with Milton Friedman at her left hand and Friedrich Hayek at her right hand. Like they cant this every night, and for them, like Liz Truss, tax cuts solve everything. A broken leg. That would be helpful if we cut taxes and you could spend that money where you wanted. Like these are people like Liz Truss who literally believe in tax cuts as a good in itself, which perhaps it is. Like, I mean, everyone would love to live in a country that worked extremely well and had low taxes and had fantastic public services and wonderful opportunities. But most people think that public policy is a little bit more complicated than that. Like that tax cuts aren't a panacea, that you actually have to, make reforms that improve the economy, that improve efficiency before you can then cut taxes and recycle it back. But that's another story. Like these are the main coalition. And the problem is that what's happened is the Reform Party is essentially an offshoot, like a cadet house of the mainline Tory party Thatcherites. Okay. So the Reform Party has taken a bunch of their votes and draws them from elsewhere. But Nigel Farage is a Thatcherite. He's like pro free market. He's kind of he's an old fashioned Manchester liberal, right? Which is what Margaret Thatcher was. She's a right wing liberal. She's not socially conservative. Meantime, you have the Cameroons, who are essentially fighting over the same turf as Keir Starmer, which is unpopular. Like if you do a Pepsi taste test challenge of the British population and just list a whole bunch of policies, Blairism, i.e., quite extreme social progressivism, constitutional reform, and status quo neoliberal economic managerialism is massively unpopular. It really is, and that's the kind of the turf that David Cameron and Tony Blair argued about. It's the turf that Jeremy Hunt and Keir Starmer argued about, or Jeremy Hunt and Rachel Reeves argued about. Like that, they believe in the same things. They believe in social liberalism. They believe in the neoliberal status quo. They believe in neoconservatism abroad or liberal universalism abroad. What they're arguing about is like whether the top rate of income tax should be 1 penny higher or lower. They're talking about like whether you should have X amount of, 50% of new NHS spend as public-private partnerships or 49%. This is the kind of the turf. Now, there's a much smaller part of the coalition, of the Conservative coalition, which I think you would call red wallers, and I would just call social conservatives. That's encapsulated by people like Danny Kruger, who is excellent, I think. He's a really impressive figure. Also people like Miriam Kate, who sadly lost her seat at the election, and I think is just...
Well, I think that this is the biggest problem for the Conservatives as well, is most of those red wallers lost their seats in the last election.
They did, and they were much more. I mean, they were much less powerful anyway. But those which, I mean, Miriam Kate, Julien, is I have very high expectations for her because she speaks very well. She actually, her policy preferences are very close to probably something like 55% of the British population. And she's kind of photogenic, right? She's quite, quite an attractive woman as far as, by political standards. And I thought because of those three things, she would do very well, but she lost her seat because of the tidal wave. So yeah, I mean, this is the problem that the Conservatives have got, is that they're like, what's happening is like reform, because of Nigel Farage's persona, has been able to take away from the Conservatives some of their Thatcherite vote, and at the same time ride the wave of the culture war, essentially, the cultural divide. Now, Nigel Farage is not going to be able to govern in a way that will please his side of the culture war. It's not in his nature. He doesn't quite understand it. He instinctively knows how to ride the wave. But if you sit down with him and talk about the kind of policies that would be needed to achieve the changes or resist, I suppose is another way, some of the progressive changes, I don't think he would either understand them or even have the stomach for them. So what he's doing is he's essentially splitting the Conservatives could, in theory, draw, if they shifted in the right way, they could draw from the cultural divide, and they could also reinvigorate themselves in the Red War, and they could build a national coalition that would actually be able to win if they shifted the right way. But the problem that they've got is that they don't have the MPs to do that because there's a very small social conservative constituent within the grander coalition of the Conservative Party. And Nigel Farage is kind of split off. So they've got real problems. Like, and Labour has problems with its coalition as well. But it's not quite as existential as the Conservative one. And it's going to take a lot of very careful navigation for them to be able to come back.
I've been comparing it a lot recently to the French Republican Party. So in 2017, it came in third place in the first round. It missed out on the second round to Emmanuel Macron and Marine Le Pen, and essentially it found itself having to think about its ideology in a sense, because it was just being completely squeezed. You had a lot of its more centrist MPs, they all fled to Macron's party, and you had people who were on the hard Catholic right who were going to the National Front, or what's it called now? I forgot. National Rally now.
Yeah, Rassemblement National.
Yeah, so I'm looking at the Conservatives today, and I'm struggling to see how they rebuild a majority in a sense, because
Can I ask you though, Julien? I'm sorry to interrupt. Like, just to stretch this analogy a little bit farther, could you also then compare the Labour Party, the kind of the Blairite New Labour Party, with Emmanuel Macron's En Marche party, in that they came to power as something new, kind of a third way in France, this kind of like cleaving closing the gap between left and right, while also offering kind of technocratic excellence to just run the country well and effectively. But it's been they've become utterly unpopular, and we're kind of, even after shenanigans, even after a deal with the kind of the Popular Front coalition of leftists, even after that, they finished third in the second round of the recent snap legislative elections. And it seems very much that once Macron goes, they could struggle sorely, and you just got this kind of a polarization of French politics between the kind of this hard left coalition, kind of led maybe by Mélenchon, I guess, and then you've got on the right, you've got the Front National and some smaller parties like the old-fashioned Republicans and also Eric Zemmour. Do you see an analogy there as well?
Well, what's very interesting about Emmanuel Macron is that he managed to win 2 elections, but with a completely different voter base. So in 2017, there was a positive correlation between his electorate and François Hollande, the socialist candidate's electorate from 2012. So he was elected on a very much centre-left platform. But then in 2022, his electorate had a very positive correlation with François Fillon, who was the Republican candidate, centre-right. So he completely shifted his electorate, and that's what he's incredibly shrewd. That's why he's still in power today, is he's able to. There was a book written about him called The Liquid President. He's able to shift shape each time, and he's able to play the far left and the far right against each other and always come out on top. So, for example, in the last legislative election, he basically fooled the far left coalition into withdrawing candidates, in order to stop Marine Le Pen winning. But all the, for example, the Elizabeth Bourne, who had come up with who had pushed through the reforms on pensions and the retirement age, which was incredibly unpopular. She managed to win her seat because they had this agreement together. But essentially, it's his party. So someone said recently, which is very good, is that he's rendered France ungovernable from the inside so that it can be governed from the outside. Um, and I think that was very true with the appointment of Michel Barnier, who essentially is the middleman between France and the EU, and he'll be able to smoothen because soon there'll be the official budgets which are given to the EU, and as many people will know, the EU essentially makes corrections to national budgets and comes back with austerity measures, and Michel Barnier will be almost of course Michel Barnier lost his last election, but he still managed to find himself as prime minister. But he'll be the managerial class which smoothens that relationship between France and Brussels. But essentially, the Republican Party and the centre-left Socialist Party both died a death in France. They were completely both squeezed out by Macron, who almost sucked up or everything between the centre-left and the centre-right. And those two parties, I think they got 2% and 4% of the vote in the last election. And the Republican Party were in the position that the Tories are in now, where they have to decide: are we going to become a more centre party, or are we going to dip our toes into the right wing populist pool?
Yeah.
And essentially, it chose the centre, died a death, and now actually one of its members, Eric Ciotti, he broke away and he decided to support the National Rally in the legislative, and they've broken away, made their own right wing, more populist part. They call themselves the Republicans on the right. But that is the warning to the Conservatives: is which way are they going to go, to the centre or to the right? But
well,
I think
I mean, it is a problem, even more, not just from a position of principle, not just from a position of ideology, but from a position of electoral mechanics as well, because the Conservative Party finished second, so they finished second or first with second to the Liberal Democrats in a lot of constituencies. So that was a bad way of saying basically the Conservatives are either second to the Liberal Democrats or were first with the Liberal Democrats second in a lot of constituencies. So in the next election, a lot of the Conservative Party's target seats will be battlegrounds with the Liberal Democrats. Now, the Liberal Democrats are very kind of socially progressive, kind of left of center economics, big believers in the kind of, Blairite style technocracy, but also have done extremely well with the NIMBYs in terms of supporting NIMBYs in preventing stuff from being built, from reservoirs to power stations to electricity cable interconnectors to new housing projects. So on the one hand, the Conservatives have to put together a policy suite that allows them to combat those seats. Otherwise, they'll just get wiped out on them. On the other side, you have the Conservatives either either finish second to, or have as second, or lost because the right-wing vote was split. Labour won because the right-wing vote was split with Reform. So either like Reform second and the Tories first, or Tories second and Reform first, or Labour won simply because, I don't know, like Labour got 30,000 votes, the Tories got 25,000, and Reform got 22,000. So if that right-wing vote had been unified, the Tories would have won easily. So they've also got to come up with a policy platform which would be culturally traditionalist, it would be socially conservative, it would be economically kind of I hesitate to say right of center, actually, because like the new populism actually quite want some left of center ideas. They probably
Yeah,
want
yeah.
industrial policy. They probably want a strong state that's able to provide good public services like transport and healthcare and all of the rest. But at the same time, they don't want, they also want to take on certain left-wing shibboleths within the state, like, cut down on a lot of the nonsense that the state spends money on. So, in British terms, at least, you don't just have this principled decision: do we turn to the populists, the populists or the technocrats, essentially? But you also have an extremely difficult electoral mechanics dilemma about which way you turn, and it could be that in trying to square that circle, they managed to be nothing to no man. They managed to be a jack of all trades but a master of none, and that's
Just to
yeah.
add to your point as well, not just on a national scale electorally, but within Parliament itself, I think, according to the bookies anyway, it looks like one of the right wing, and I say this lightly, one of the right wing candidates is going to win. However, someone broke it down perfectly. So this was based on questions that had been asked to the MPs in the past. Around 80% of remaining Conservative MPs described themselves as socially liberal, and around 75% of MPs still in Parliament described themselves more to the centre than to the right. So if you get a Badenoch or a Generic winning this leadership, how then do you control a party which is pretty much majority opposed to everything you stand for? It's another
Well,
tough
I
question.
wouldn't be too like, look, if you get a strong and publicly popular Conservative leader, Conservative Party MPs will fall behind him or her like sheep on the way to the mortuary. They're not like Conservative MPs are not in the known for being particularly querulous or insurrectionist when it comes to party leaders. Like the left is, the Labour left is, like, Starmer. You will start seeing increasingly. I guarantee listeners will know before it happens, but within the next year or so, you'll start to see like really serious attacks on Starmer from the left. From the left.
Similar
Uh,
to the end of the Blair era.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, look, it's not that long ago that Jeremy Corbyn was Labour leader. Now, Jeremy Corbyn appalled central party control. The central party, the people who run the centre of the Labour Party were disgusted. The elites who support the Labour Party were disgusted. They hated Jeremy Corbyn and everything he stood for, and they fought a highly successful, well-funded guerrilla campaign against him. But the point is that they couldn't get rid of him because he had genuine, real support within the Conservative Party itself. Within the Labour Party itself. It basically is if loads of quite serious left wingers, like working class left wingers and student left wingers, had all got together in the United States and put together a system that basically crushed the Democratic Party elites and put Bernie Sanders in charge. And then, despite the best efforts of the New York Times and the Washington Post and Nancy Pelosi, just couldn't get rid of him for not one but two elections. Exactly that happened today. Like that sentiment still remains. It hasn't gone away. It hasn't gone away. And you'll see Starmer doing it, but the Conservative Party are simply not. It's not in their nature to. I mean, like they're very like, or whatever you say, like those old spitting image sketches where like Margaret Thatcher was basically a kind of almost like a totalitarian but regal figure lording it over her cabinet. That it was very funny. The old sketch where she takes them out to dinner and the waiter said, "How would you like your steak?" And she said, "Oh, raw, of course." And he said, "And what about the vegetables?" And she said, "Oh, they'll have steak as well." It's that's the that that's a stereotype, but and it's very funny, but it's also true. I don't think that you're just not going to get these kind of blamongers who are interested. Like Peter Hitchens speaks very well, like really quite humorously, but also very penetratingly about how the Conservative Party was also a vehicle for the sons of gentlemen to achieve political power.
Yeah.
And that's still the case today. And part of their problem is that they face an ideological opponent without an ideology of their own to fight against it. But on the flip side of that, if somebody like Kenny Badenoch or Jenrick comes in with something that appeals to the populists and is a bit more hard right, well, goodness, some of these young men of Balliol with smooth hands might quail, and they might feel a little bit embarrassed at that, when hanging out with their fashionable friends. But they'll just stick behind it because the whole point of them joining the party was to gain power, right? I don't think they have to worry about the MPs themselves.
So let's look at the candidates in the running. So of course we lost Priti Patel and Mel Stride. I don't think Mel Stride was a surprise, but for Priti Patel to go out first, did that surprise you a bit?
No, not at all. No, the UK Home Office is a kind of like a graveyard of political careers. Like what you want to do as a prospective party leader is you want it like of the three great officers of state, like Treasury, like Chancellor of the Exchequer, Foreign Minister, and Home Secretary. Is you want to be in the Foreign Office, right? Because foreign affairs is basically set by number 10. It's not like you're doing it. It's not like the days of Edmund Grey before the First World War, where he was essentially running foreign policy, right? So they actually do nothing. They just kind of swan around the world doing photo shoots in front of the Champs-Elysees, hanging out in the Rose Garden with the President of the US. Like the Home Office, though, that has like real effects on voters, and it's a shambles. It's a disgrace. It's like it should be abolished and replaced because it's so rotten that like there's nothing else to save. If you cut out all of the cancer from the Home Office, there'd only be a couple of healthy cells left. And Priti Patel was really very tarnished by her long period as Home Minister because she talked such a big game on immigration. And she used fairly divisive language, and she made herself massively unpopular with the broader elites. And then she achieved nothing that would have given her the kudos to recreate a coalition that could have taken her to power. And really, since then, she's become an increasing irrelevance within the party. Look at Suella Braverman. She hasn't. I mean, she isn't running, right? As far as I understand, she's not in. Is that right?
No, and there were very strong rumors that she was going to defect to Reform, but that's gone quiet recently.
But and she's another Home Office alum. It's really because what the Conservative Party did was that they said like, okay, guys, if we're going to do something about migration, we're going to do something about crime. we need to have somebody there who talks tough on crime and talks tough on migration and talks tough on stopping the small boats. And then you send somebody to the Home Office who talks tough in that way, and they're utterly incapable of doing anything about it because they're just not given the tools to. And the Home Office itself is such a shambles that the only thing that they're good at is obfuscation and preventing people, elected ministers doing what they want. That's the only thing they're good at. So yeah, like I wasn't shocked at Priti Patel at all. Like Priti Patel could never win a general election in the UK. She couldn't. So I wasn't shocked at all. Mel Stride, obviously not shocked at all either, Julien.
So looking at the four that are still in, so current pricing on Bet365, we have Tom Tugendhat is 11-1, so he's been a major drifter. James Cleverley, who's been probably my surprise package of the competition,
Yeah.
he's now 5-1. Kemi Badenoch, who did start as the favourite, I think she was even price. She's now 2-1, and Robert Jenrick is now the odds-on favourite, 4-5. Could we essentially say that Jenrick and Badenoch represent the right wing of the party, whereas the other two represent the centre?
I'm less certain about. Excuse me, I just dropped something. I'm less certain about Cleverley represent the centre, but probably yes. But certainly Tom Tugendhat does. Tom Tugendhat is
the warmonger.
Yeah, I'll not call him by his nickname in case there's families listening. But yeah, I mean, Tom Tugendhat is like. I mean, here's a question for you. Like, would Tom Tugendhat look out of place on the Labour front bench? I don't think so.
Not this one, certainly.
Yeah, I don't think so. I mean, not this one, not Gordon Brown's, not Tony Blair's. He really wouldn't have looked out of place. And yeah, you're right. He's like the Americans would love Tom Tugendhat, like the Democratic Party love Tom Tugendhat to take over. I mean, I actually think he's not like. I was going to say he's not. Certainly, his foreign policy is not based in like any form of reality. People who look with objective eyes could recognize. But actually, in that sense, he is he's the paragon of the liberal universalist. He's the paragon of the British foreign policy, international relations blob. Like he represents everything that they believe. I think it was him who made. Excuse me. I think it was he who made an extremely emotional, quite nicely worded speech in Parliament when the United States withdrew from Afghanistan on very short notice, and we had those disastrous and quite harrowing scenes in Kabul. It was very much this generation's last helicopter from the US Embassy in Hanoi, or Saigon, I should say, moment. And Tom Tugendhat made this really impassioned and very emotional speech in Parliament. I think it was him anyway. I might be wrong with that. Saying that maybe British forces could stay there and do a job. And I remember thinking to myself, well, this is he just doesn't inhabit planet Earth. The British Army has exactly zero. And when I say exactly, I mean exactly zero ability to go into Kabul and achieve anything that he would want, without the Americans there to support, none at all. I mean, maybe we could send some special forces in to do hostage rescue and get out again, maybe. But apart from that, that's it. There would be no ability to garrison any bases or any cities within Afghanistan. But he really believed that. Equally, he's along with Tobias Elwood, I think I'm right in saying he was in
mm,
favor
mm,
of imposing a no-fly zone over Ukraine in 2022, 2 years ago. So I mean, he was, and no-fly zone is a euphemism for war with the Russian Federation,
mm, mm,
um, which again, the Royal Air Force, for all its great merits and all its bravery and all its quite impressive technology, has zero ability to do. And as I say, it would lead to war. Like a no-fly zone means, taking on Russian air assets. It also means targeting Russian area denial, anti-access assets, like surface-to-air missiles, for example, like radar installations. So it means literal war. I mean, so this is the sort of person he is in terms of foreign policy. In terms of domestic policy, Tugendhat is just down. Yeah, there's no essential difference in terms of economic policy. It's literally Blairism, but with a preference for a lower tax, lower spend, marginally.
mm, mm.
I,
I
I mean,
think,
he would do okay in those aforementioned Liberal Democrats marginals.
mm, mm. James Cleverly, to me, he's like the archetype of the Tory loyalist. I mean, whoever has been the leader, he seems to have defended them to the death, and
Yeah, yeah,
whatever position they. I mean, I remember he was almost like the last the Japanese soldier who didn't realize the war was over when it came to Theresa May's Brexit deal. He was ready to die on a hill for that deal. Is there anything more to James Cleverly than
yeah.
just
I think
loyalty
you
to the
summed it up very.
leader?
You know what actually? You know what James Cleverly reminds you of? Do you remember that episode of Yes Minister where
Hmm.
there was a rumor of uh, a rumor of a reshuffle? The prime minister was going to reshuffle, and obviously Jim Hacker was very nervous about whether he'd be shuffled up, down, like out of the cabinet altogether, maybe booted to the House of Lords. So he was going around asking everyone, like asking Sir Humphrey, asking Bernard, even asking his chauffeur, his government chauffeur, like how they thought he'd done, and they all answered, "I think you've done all right. Yeah, you've done all right." Like it's like nothing more than no, you've done all right. And like everyone he asked, like, what's the rumors? Like how do people? You've done all right, Minister. That's how I see James Cleverly. He doesn't seem
Mm,
to,
mm,
he hasn't been involved in any disasters. He hasn't been utterly shamed, in any way. I mean, in by conservative standards, of course. I mean, we're not talking about the Singapore civil service here in terms of quality. Um, so by those standards, he's done all right. And that's how I see it. Like whoever whoever wins this election, it won't be him, but whoever wins this election, like this leadership contest, he can expect a decent shadow ministerial brief. Nothing big, but he could maybe expect, I don't know, shadow health secretary or shadow whatever. I mean, like he's done all right. He's quite
mm.
clever. He's quite good on TV. He has decent policy ideas he's all right, Julien.
And that leaves us the final two, who, according to the bookies, it looks like it will be one of these two, our next leaders. So we have Kemi Badenoch and Robert Jenrick. Now Kemi was, as I said, the favourite going into this. I think quite recently there was resurfacing of footage of Kemi Badenoch when she was, I believe, business secretary, when she was almost taking pride in the fact that she had dished out a lot more working visas for um, for people coming into this country. I think
Yeah,
that's given her a bit of a knockback in this contest. Oh, yeah, what are your thoughts on these two?
I mean, yeah, I've long very much liked Kemi Badenoch as a politician. She, for somebody on my side of the cultural divide, this kind of social conservative cultural divide, it's a real pleasure to see somebody who has quite a decent mind and is able to just kick the right people over and over again in Parliament. It's a pleasure, and I kind of enjoy those clips that go around Twitter and YouTube of her, knocking 7 shades of what out of, I don't know, Jess Phillips or whoever. So there's that side of her which is very likable. I've also seen interviews with her where she's actually quite impressive. She comes from a STEM background, which is quite actually great. Like not another Oxford PPE graduate. And I think sometimes in interviews that STEM background serves her in good stead. She has it seems to me, a kind of a cooler analytical mind. She's very direct. She's very, something about Kemi Badenoch. You don't get this sense so much that she's been focus grouped to death, that she's been media trained to death, right? Like, and I think that voters tend to like that. One of the reasons that Jeremy Corbyn did pretty well is because he was obviously genuine. Like, I don't agree with Jeremy Corbyn's views, and I don't think you do, Julien, either. But he was difficult to really hate because he was like an honest bloke, right? He spoke very slowly and calmly. He flew low and slow, if you know what I mean. And he knew what he believed, and he said what he believed, and that was the end of it. And I think in this day and age, there are so few political characters. It's like cars where they're all like every 4-door saloon, sedan car, whatever, looks fairly similar. Like the latest Kia looks quite similar to a modern Mondeo or modern Focus or whatever, which also looks similar to like politicians are the same. It's like you've got these, you employ 58,000 kind of, PR and focus group and polling people and speech writers, and they look at all of the data and they say, like, this is the sweet spot, and it creates something that's not, it doesn't quite feel real. Whereas I don't quite think that Kemi Badenoch yet has been through that process. So I personally find her actually quite likable. I think she's done very well. I think perhaps being voted prime minister the last time I think it was I think the Conservative Party kind of made a mistake not voting for her when they voted for Truss.
Oh, definitely.
Yeah, that's another matter. But maybe prime minister would be too big a jump for one so inexperienced. As we saw with Rishi Sunak, he struggled politically, and I think that a lot of that was down to experience. So yeah, I find it quite interesting. Jenrick is less known to the public. Jenrick is somebody who, policy-wise, he seems to get it, in inverted commas. He has if you want to take on reform, if you want to lean into the culture wars, like Jenrick would do extremely well in that. I think he would be able to present this idea of a reinvented Conservative Party who listens to the people, or that's his policy suite anyway. But I personally think that Badenoch would be a more attractive proposition for the people. Now, that's another question, like what they would do with the Conservative Party, whether I like them or not. The question you asked is who's going to win. It's more difficult to tell because in these leadership elections, like what you might get, for instance, let's say that, I mean, Jenrick is favourite at the moment, okay? But let's say that Badenoch has got like X number of supporters who could get her through the next round, okay? What she might do with some of those surplus supporters is tell them to swing behind, I don't know, whoever, like swing behind Tugendhat, for instance, to push him over the line to get Jenrick out, or like there might be a kind of, or say Kemi Badenoch might be just disliked by members, by the party itself, and there might be a kind of a stop Kemi campaign that goes on. Like, we can't have her, whatever happens. So there's a lot of politicking that goes on behind this, and you don't always get the most popular two being voted in. You might get one of them.
I remember when Boris Johnson's supporters, he actually decreased his amount from the previous round because they swung behind Jeremy Hunt to
Yeah,
stop Michael Gove getting into the final two.
exactly so, and that was revenge for Michael Gove doing the same thing. He resigned from the leadership race specifically so that he could stick the knife into Boris Johnson, and that's what lost Boris Johnson the deal when I think Theresa May won it, right? That was
yeah.
So this sort of thing, and I think in the last leadership election, but one, the one that Liz Truss won, I suspect on popularity alone, Penny Mordaunt would have got to the final two, but she went out in the final three.
Yeah.
So it's difficult. Excuse me again, I've got a frog in my throat. So it's difficult to tell who would win. I don't necessarily have any predictions there, but my personal instinct is to believe that Kemi Badenoch would go down better in the cut. Like, I get the feeling that my man would like Kemi Badenoch. My man would say, "Yeah, she comes across as no nonsense. She'll sort them out. Kemi will
He
sort
gets
them out."
it.
Do you know what I mean when I say that? Right? She'd go down well with the kind of
Elbow grease kind of character, I think she gives off.
The which one? Sorry.
She gives an elbow grease kind of character. Like she'll roll up her sleeves and get stuck in, I think.
Well, I also think that she could lean in to the traditional kind of African matriarch impression, right? So, like, anybody who's ever met, like an African mother, like, they know they're tough people. They do not brook like cheek or nonsense from their kids. Like I have a relation who is a black matriarch, and she like kicked her son through school. Like, she just and like, once the teachers told her that they were going to put a kid in a lower stream for GCSEs. One of those where it's an easier exam, but the highest.
The IGCSE or something.
Sorry.
IGCSEs or something like that.
I don't know exactly. It's been too long, but she marched down the school and she said, like, what the hell is this? They said, well, to be honest, we don't think your son can get an A, and this maximizes his chance of getting a B. And she said, no, that's not happening. She said, you're going to put him in this stream, and like, I am going to make him work like constantly, and you're going to be a good teacher, and we're going to get him an A. And that's the. And I think the teachers were kind of mildly terrified by this, like. You like this kind of middle class, these middle class university educated people come down with this black mother saying, "I'm going to kick my son to get here, so you be a teacher as well. I'm going to be a mother." And I think that actually that sort of attitude can, be quite popular. I think it could be quite popular.
I agree, definitely.
So. Yeah, I personally, and I think that Jenrick would come across as a little bit too much like Star. Like, here's a question: who do you think could get loads of social media views with PMQ performances against Starmer? Like, who would get the most? Who would get the most viral clips? Badenoch or Jenrick?
Definitely Badenoch.
Yeah. I mean, so that's kind of my general view. But I do think that Jenrick, if you want to take on reform, if you want to lean into, the cultural divide, I think Jenrick is very good for that.
Well, he's come out and said he hopes Trump wins, doesn't he?
Yeah, absolutely. Which I think is ridiculous. Like, why? Who cares? Like, what? Like, why? I mean, have we become such a colony that now we're really interested in what happens in the elections of the metropole? Like, I just think it's colonial. It's kind of colonized behavior to be interested in this. Like, who cares, really? Like, who cares? Like when Trump was in charge, did U.S. foreign policy change? I mean, I don't think hugely. He avoided wars, which was good, actually. So, but you know, like, I mean, yeah, at least he's unafraid to say such things. I mean, Jenrick could be like the right Sadiq Khan, if that makes sense.
What a world we live in, right wing
Yeah,
Sadiq Khan.
we are cursed to be alive in interesting times, Julian.
Yeah.
And what do you think? You're the political tipster. I mean, I know you know you've brought me on as a guest, but I'm only here for my own benefit, Julian. So tell me what you think about it.
Well, my prediction is that I think Jenrick's in the final, and I do think the centre vote will swing behind one candidate to try and get theirs into the final two. So I could see maybe James Cleverly sneaking in there.
You
Um,
think Tugendhat is much weaker than Cleverly in terms of the centre?
this is based off the first round result. I think naturally you swing your vote behind the
Yeah.
candidate from your side of the aisle, which has the most votes currently. And I think, as you said, Cleverly, he's never really disgraced himself. Tugendhat as well. He is a respected figure in his party. He has his military background, um, and I think being like unapologetically over the top supporting Ukraine is pretty much the status quo position in both parties. So
Pretty much the same.
uh,
It's like the only position. I mean, there's no, you know, there's no JD Vance in British politics, right? And
no,
like even before he became Trump's presidential nominee, he was a senator, and there was like, you know, there's no JD Vance figure in the House of Commons.
no, definitely not. So I think Jenrick beats Cleverly in the final would be my prediction. I
Yeah.
think Badenoch comes in third. Um, but I mean, there's still conference to come. Someone pointed out that when David Cameron was elected leader, he arrived at conference with very, very little support.
Uh,
But he managed to persuade a lot of people at
well, he
conference
persuaded the media
itself.
class. Like I remember that very well. I mean, you're a bit younger than me, but I
W-
distinctly remember what happened. So what he did at the conference was he took off his suit jacket and he gave a he gave a speech in shirt sleeves without a script, like without a teleprompter, without the speech written out. It
Reminds
was
me a bit of the thick of it when they said, "Oh, this is a no-tie zone." Like,
yeah, exactly. It was exactly like that. He just wowed the media corps with doing this, with being able to give a speech like that off the cuff. And
wasn't it at that wasn't
sorry.
it at that conference as well where he described himself as the heir of Tony Blair?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, that was the. I mean, you see, so that gang, that kind of those Islington Tories. It was people like Cameron, it was Gove, it was Osborne. People like all, but also big figures like Steve Hilton. I don't know if you remember him at all. He's in the States now doing media stuff. And a lot of other kind of media, like you know, Michael Gove is married or was married to uh, what's her name? She's a really famous columnist for the Daily Mail. I forget her name now. And those Islington Tories were quite a small group, or not a particularly powerful group within the party at the time. But they had been planning and had kind of ideas about where they wanted to take the party, which was to accept Blair's social and political constitutional reforms. And they were obviously all of these people were kind of social liberals themselves. You know, they didn't believe in things like, you know, tough criminal justice. They didn't believe in kind of traditional social conservatism. So they had this idea that they would accept all of these Blairite changes, and they would present this as a kind of a modernization of the Conservative Party. And then what they would also do is they would accept Blair's kind of economic changes in terms of, technocratic neoliberal economics as well.
mm, mm,
But they would have an emphasis on things like slightly lower taxes and talking up entrepreneurs and all of the rest of it. So what Cameron did is he came in and he gave this speech, which the old dears from the Shire who turn up at these conferences just love this well-groomed young man from Oxford University giving this. Oh, wow, look at what he could do. And the media loved it. And of course, that clique of Islington Tories had a lot of contacts with the media. And it was just amazing. It was like overnight, Cameron went from nobody to literally being the heir apparent.
mhm.
Like even before any polling had been done with Conservative members, it was like the media had decided that this is who they wanted. And it would like that was it. It was done. And after that, he was unstoppable, really. So yeah, I mean, I guess at conference something could change. I expect Jenrick to be quite good at conference. Actually, I think he will speak very well. I would say though that the reason that Liz Truss won that election is for years she had been working to create an image among the Conservative Party membership, not the MPs, but the membership, like the rank and file people who turn up at, the South Buckingham Conservative Party office for tea and cakes on a Wednesday night. Okay. Like among that sort of people, they read the Telegraph and the Daily Mail, and maybe the ones who are really interested in politics, which is only a few, read the Spectator, but mainly, it's those who get their news from the Mail and the Telegraph and live quite comfortable lives and are kind of conservative by instinct. Truss had been for years working to create an image among that group of people that she was one of theirs, that she was like their woman. Like she thought like them, she looked like them, her ideas were theirs, right? And that's why she won. That's why she was like, not because she was an impressive politician, because she wasn't. She was an awful politician. She was horribly, like, if you think Kamala Harris is bad in front of the TV, way worse. She was very wooden. She was liable to trip up. She was liable to gaffe. She did nothing of note at the Department of Business Development. She was an appalling foreign minister. Like she doesn't come across as having like a high IQ or like even much above average. But for those conservative men, she was one of theirs. Like she was the woman that they liked. So I wonder when it gets down to the final two, who will be the candidate that group likes? Like who feels that's what's important, really. Because like
Does anyone really
by the way,
know how many members the party still has? I mean,
yeah,
it must have been reduced to there's probably just the Bullington Club left in there, but
yeah, like a few retired colonels who can't bring themselves to vote for Farage. That sort of. I don't know. I
So
mean, is it even 100,000 anymore? Like what?
I don't know. No one
I mean,
really knows, I think.
I think at one time in the in living memory for somebody who's pretty old, like a pensioner now. So like in the 1950s, the Conservative Party had 2.5 million, like nearly 3 million members, I think.
Oh well.
In a population of about 45 million.
Hmm.
It was incredible. And then Labour had like 1.5 million or 1 million plus all of the union members as well. Like these were genuinely popular parties. And yeah, I think now I'm right in saying the Royal Society for the Protection of Birds has more members than the Conservative Party. I'm not joking.
I wouldn't be surprised.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay then. So so we've got the Tory Party conference coming up soon, and then the voting commences again. I believe we'll have our leader by the beginning of November.
Yeah, we'll
So
see.
we
You know,
shall wait and see.
should say before you go, Julian, this, like I've been asked on Twitter a few times, like why. So Starmer is, I think one of Starmer's tactics is to take a whole bunch of really ugly, difficult decisions now with the economy, so that they're forgotten by, you know, in 4 years' time, by the time he has to call an election. But he's also taken a whole range of other steps as well. For instance, suspending the legislative process of legislation that would have protected free speech at universities.
Mm.
You know, they're talking about further clamping down on things like hate speech. They're talking about making very serious constitutional changes. People have asked me a few times actually, why isn't there more of a battle about this? Well, the reason is there's no real opposition. Like Rishi Sunak is a placeholder, and every Conservative member knows it. Every Conservative MP knows it. So there's no real unified opposition with a, you know, like a plan, an idea. And even when we see white smoke coming out of Conservative Party HQ in November, we have a leader, you know, it'll then take them time to formulate a program and get buy-in from enough MPs to kind of carry it through. And then you've got Christmas. So Keir Starmer is going to have free run for the rest of this year, really. It's something to bear in mind. He can do what he wants.
Always ending on a very sobering note. So
Yeah,
we're looking
it's
forward
the
to
dark days we live in, Julian.
some more dark Blairism for Christmas.
Yeah, exactly. It's going to be roast bug protein.
But anyway, it's been a pleasure chatting to you, Collingwood, as usual, and yeah, hopefully have you back on soon, probably for the Tory Leadership Contest next year, and the one after that.
Yeah, exactly. Or maybe for the, you know, the snap general election caused by economic collapse. Let's let's see, shall we? But yeah,
Yeah,
Julian, it's been a pleasure and an education, and I do hope you have me on soon again.
thank you very much, and thanks everyone for listening.